Maria Rodriguez had never set foot in a fancy restaurant before. At 58, her hands told the story of a lifetime spent cooking for others, calloused from chopping vegetables, small burn marks from decades at the stove, and nails kept practical and short. These were not the hands you'd expect to see in Le Petit Jardin, where movie stars and business moguls came to dine. "Are you sure about this place?" Maria asked her daughter Lucia, smoothing down the front of her floral dress, the nicest one she owned, saved for church Sundays and special occasions. They stood outside the restaurant, its name spelled out in elegant golden script above doors that looked heavy and important. "It's your birthday, Mama," Lucia said, squeezing her mother's arm. "You deserve something special after all these years of cooking for everyone else." The truth was, Maria had never traveled far from her small rural village until now. This visit, to see her daughter in the city, was already overwhelming. The tall buildings, the constant noise, the rush of people always hurrying somewhere important. And now this restaurant, with its valet parking and men in suits nodding at guests as they entered. Inside, crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings, and the tables were covered with crisp white tablecloths that looked like they'd never seen a food stain. Maria noticed how everyone spoke in hushed tones, as if loud voices might crack the delicate wine glasses arranged perfectly at each setting. A tall, thin man with a tablet approached them. "Do you have a reservation?" he asked, his eyes quickly taking in Maria's simple dress and the worn purse clutched tightly in her hands. "Yes, under Lucia Rodriguez. For two," her daughter answered confidently. The man checked his tablet, nodded, and led them to a small table near the back of the restaurant. Maria couldn't help but notice they passed several empty tables with better views. She said nothing, not wanting to embarrass her daughter, who had clearly gone to great expense for this dinner. "Your server will be with you shortly," the man said, placing leather-bound menus in front of them before walking away. "This is too much," Maria whispered to her daughter. "The food must cost a fortune here." Lucia smiled. "Don't worry about the prices, Mama. This is my treat. Order whatever looks good." Maria opened the menu and immediately felt lost. The descriptions were filled with words she didn't recognize, things like reduction and confit, and ingredients she'd never heard of. Most dishes had French names that she couldn't pronounce. When the waiter came, Lucia ordered confidently, but Maria pointed timidly to one of the few dishes she recognized. "The chicken, please. The coq au vin?" "Excellent choice," the waiter said with a small bow. "Chef Antoine's signature dish." As they waited for their food, Maria took in the room around her. At a nearby table, a group of well-dressed people laughed loudly, clearly comfortable in this environment. A couple at another table barely spoke to each other, both focused on their phones despite the romantic setting. "Do you know?" Maria said, quietly to her daughter. "This reminds me a little of the time your grandfather took us to that hotel restaurant when I was 12. Remember I told you that story? It was the only time we ever ate anywhere fancy." Lucia smiled. "You said Grandpa saved for months, just for that one meal. He wanted us to know there was a bigger world out there." Maria nodded, her eyes growing, distant with the memory. "He always said, simple doesn't mean small-minded." Their conversation was interrupted as servers arrived with their appetizers, tiny works of art on large white plates. Maria stared at her plate, unsure where to begin with the small tower of colorful ingredients arranged so carefully it seemed a shame to disturb them. As the evening progressed, Maria began to relax a little. The food was delicious, even if the portions were smaller than what she was used to serving at home. She enjoyed watching her daughter in this environment. Lucia seemed so grown up, so at ease in this world that was so foreign to Maria. When the main courses arrived, Maria's eyes widened at the sight of her coq au vin. The plate held what looked like half a chicken, beautifully arranged in a dark, rich sauce with small pearl onions and mushrooms. She took a small bite and closed her eyes, tasting the flavors. "Is everything to your liking?" asked a voice with a strong French accent. Maria opened her eyes to see a tall man in a white chef's jacket standing at their table. His dark hair was swept back, and a neat beard framed a face that Maria immediately recognized from the large portrait hanging near the restaurant entrance. "You're the chef," she said, surprised. "Chef Antoine Durand," he confirmed with a small nod. "I like to check on my guests, especially those trying my signature dish for the first time." "It's very good," Maria said politely, though something in her expression must have given her away. The chef raised an eyebrow. "But?" he prompted. Maria shook her head quickly. No, it's wonderful, very fancy." "Mama makes the best coq au vin I've ever tasted," Lucia said proudly. "She's been cooking for our whole family for as long as I can remember." "Is that so?" Chef Antoine's tone changed slightly, a hint of amusement creeping in. "And what do you think of my version compared to yours?" Maria looked uncomfortable. "They're different, that's all. Yours is very, professional." "But," the chef pressed again, "it's just, my mother taught me to use a bit of blood orange when making the sauce," Maria finally admitted, "and a pinch of cinnamon. It's probably not the right way, but blood, orange, in coq au vin?" The chef's eyebrows shot up. Several nearby diners had gone quiet, watching the exchange. "That's not traditional at all." "I know," Maria said quietly, wishing she hadn't spoken. "It's just how my mother taught me." The chef looked at her for a long moment, then a small, challenging smile spread across his face. "Perhaps you would like to show us this unusual technique, since you think it improves upon my recipe." Maria's eyes widened. "Oh no, I didn't mean—" "I insist," the chef said, still smiling but with a glint in his eye that made Maria uneasy. "Why don't you come to my kitchen and show my staff how a simple woman makes coq au vin?" There was no mistaking his tone now. Several diners at nearby tables shifted uncomfortably, while others watched with the barely disguised interest of people expecting to witness someone's humiliation. "Chef, that's not necessary," Lucia began, but Maria placed a hand on her daughter's arm. "It's all right," she said quietly. Then looking up at the chef, she nodded. "If you're sure you want me in your kitchen, I'd be happy to show you what I know." For just a moment, Chef Antoine looked surprised, as if he hadn't expected her to accept. Then he gestured toward the back of the restaurant. "After you, madame." As Maria stood and followed the chef, she felt the eyes of every diner on her. She straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin slightly, the way her mother had taught her to do whenever she felt out of place. "Walk like you belong," her mother used to say, "even when you don't." The kitchen doors swung open, revealing a world Maria had never seen before. A bustling, stainless steel environment where at least a dozen people in white uniforms moved with practiced precision between stations. The noise hit her first, the sizzle of pans, the clatter of utensils, shouted orders in French and English. Then the IQ smells washed over her, rich stocks bubbling, herbs being crushed, meat searing. For just a moment, Maria hesitated at the threshold. This was so far from her small kitchen at home with its worn wooden table and the old stove that sometimes needed coaxing to light properly. But then she felt something familiar beneath the chaos, the rhythm of a kitchen at work, the dance of people creating food together. Different tools, different scale, but at its heart, not so different from what she knew. Chef Antoine turned to his staff, speaking loudly enough to be heard over the kitchen noise. "This is Maria. She thinks her coq au vin is better than mine. She's going to show us her special technique." Several of the kitchen staff paused what they were doing to look at Maria, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed amusement. A young man in the corner didn't bother to hide his snicker. The chef led Maria to a prep station and gestured to it with a flourish. "Please, show us what you know." The kitchen fell silent as Maria stood at the prep station, all eyes watching, her with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Chef Antoine crossed his arms, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. He clearly expected her to back down, to admit she was out of her league in this professional setting. "Would you like an apron?" he asked, his tone suggesting he was simply extending the joke. "Yes, please," Maria answered quietly but firmly. A young woman with a tight ponytail handed Maria a crisp white apron. As Maria tied it around her waist, she noticed the woman's name tag read Inez. There was a gentleness in Inez's eyes that stood apart from the others. "What ingredients will you need for this unique version of coq au vin?" Chef Antoine asked, gesturing dramatically to his well-stocked kitchen. Maria looked around, taking in the gleaming surfaces and expensive equipment. It was intimidating, but the ingredients were familiar, and cooking was cooking, no matter where. "You did it." "The usual things," she said. "Chicken, red wine, bacon, mushrooms, pearl onions." She paused. "And a blood orange, if you have one, plus a small stick of cinnamon." The chef raised his eyebrows but nodded to one of his sous chefs. "Get the lady what she needs." As the ingredients were gathered, Maria rolled up her sleeves. Her hands, marked by decades of cooking for her family, moved with the muscle memory of someone who could prepare a meal while half asleep. She wasn't flashy, didn't twirl knives, or toss ingredients in the air like she'd seen chefs do on TV. But there was an undeniable grace to her movements, efficient, precise, and confident. "You'll want to start with the bacon," she said, her voice growing a little stronger as she settled into the familiar rhythm of cooking. "But not the fancy kind. You want the fatty pieces that most people throw away." "We use lardons here, chef," Antoine said with a hint of condescension. "Premium cut." Maria nodded politely but selected a fattier section from what was offered. "The fat is where the flavor lives," she said simply. "My grandmother taught me that." She began dicing the bacon into small, irregular chunks, not the perfect cubes that professional chefs preferred. When Chef Antoine opened his mouth to correct her, she just smiled. The different sizes cook differently. Some get very crispy, others stay tender. It makes each bite interesting. To her surprise, the chef closed his mouth and watched. As Maria worked, the kitchen staff gradually returned to their tasks, though many stole glances her way. She rendered the fat from the bacon slowly, explaining as she went. "My grandmother was a cook in a French household before the war," she said, her hands never stopping their work. "The family had fled France and brought her with them. She learned from their chef, but adapted everything to use what was available where we lived." Chef Antoine's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Where was that?" "A small village outside Valencia," Maria answered, now adding carefully chopped onions to the pan. The sizzle and aroma drew a few more observers. During difficult times, she had to be creative. As she browned the chicken pieces, bone and skin on, Maria worked with the quiet confidence of someone who had prepared this dish hundreds of times. She didn't measure ingredients but added them by eye and feel, tasting frequently and adjusting as she went. When it came time to add the wine, she stopped and looked at Chef Antoine. "In my village, we didn't always have good wine for cooking. Sometimes we had to use what was available, often wine that had turned a bit too acidic. We use a Burgundy," the chef said. "The finest available." Maria nodded appreciatively. "That will be wonderful, but we'll want to balance it." She reached for the blood orange that had been provided, cutting it in half and squeezing just a small amount of juice into the mixture. The sweetness of the orange balances the acidity, and the hint of citrus brightens the dish. Chef Antoine watched closely as she added a small piece of cinnamon stick. "Just enough to warm the flavor, not enough to taste it directly," Maria explained. As she worked, something unexpected happened. The kitchen's atmosphere began to change. The snickering stopped. The crossed arms loosened. Chefs who had been working on other dishes found reasons to pass by Maria's station, inhaling deeply as they went. "My mother always said cooking is about making people happy," Maria said as she adjusted the heat under her pan. "Not about showing off or being fancy." Chef Antoine said nothing, but his eyes hadn't left her hands. When Maria finally added the mushrooms and pearl onions, she selected each one carefully, checking for quality. "The ingredients do most of the work," she said. "We just help them shine." A heavenly aroma had begun to fill the kitchen, rich, complex, and somehow both familiar and new. Even the most skeptical staff members were now openly watching. One of the senior sous chefs leaned over to whisper something to Chef Antoine, who nodded without taking his eyes off Maria's pot. "How long have you been cooking?" the chef finally asked, his tone noticeably softer than before. Since I was tall enough to reach the stove with a step stool, Maria answered with a small smile. So about 50 years, give or take. Inez, the young chef who had given Maria the apron, had abandoned her station entirely and was now standing close by. My grandmother cooked like this, she said quietly. No measuring cups, no timers, just feeling. Maria nodded. The recipe is just a map. The journey is different each time. As the dish simmered, filling the kitchen with its aroma, Maria noticed something she hadn't expected. Respect in the eyes watching her. Not pity or amusement, but genuine interest. Even Chef Antoine had dropped his superior attitude and was asking thoughtful questions about her technique. Where did you learn to hold the knife that way? He asked as she finally minced some fresh herbs. My father was a butcher, she explained. He taught me that the knife is just an extension of your hand. You don't fight with it, you work with it. The dish took nearly an hour to complete, a luxury rarely afforded in a busy restaurant kitchen. But strangely, no one complained about the station being occupied. Instead, other chefs found excuses to work nearby, asking quiet questions or simply observing. When Maria finally declared the coq au vin ready, there was a moment of hushed anticipation. Chef Antoine personally brought over a tasting spoon, dipped it in the rich, glossy sauce, and took a taste. The kitchen went silent. Every eye was on the chef as he considered the flavor. Maria stood quietly, hands folded in front of her apron, neither anxious nor boastful. After what seemed like an eternity, Chef Antoine looked at Maria with an expression she couldn't quite read. Was it surprise? Respect? Perhaps a bit of both. This is... He began, then paused, searching for the right words. This is not traditional. Maria nodded, accepting what she thought was criticism. But, the chef continued, it is magnificent. A collective exhale seemed to pass through the kitchen. Someone in the back let out a low whistle. The orange, Chef Antoine said, taking another taste. It creates a brightness that cuts through the richness. And the cinnamon, it's almost undetectable, but it adds a warmth that lingers. These are not classical techniques, but... He looked at Maria with new eyes. They are brilliant. Maria felt her cheeks grow warm. It's just how my family has always made it. The chef turned to his staff. This is why we must never stop learning, he announced. True cooking comes from the heart, not just from training or tradition. He looked back at Maria. Would you allow us to serve your version to some of our guests tonight? As a special offering? Maria's eyes widened. My cooking? In your restaurant? I think my customers would benefit from a little home wisdom, Chef Antoine said, a new humility in his voice. Before Maria could answer, Lucia burst through the kitchen doors, her face a mask of concern. Mama, are you okay? You've been in here for over an hour. She stopped short when she saw the scene, her mother looking completely at ease in the professional kitchen, surrounded by chefs who were regarding her with obvious respect. Lucia, Maria said with a smile, I've been cooking. Chef Antoine turned to Lucia. Your mother has been teaching us, he corrected. And now, if she permits, we would like to serve her exceptional coq au vin to some of our guests. Lucia looked back and forth between them, confusion giving way to amazement. Really? Only if you and your mother will be my special guests at the chef's table tonight, Antoine added, so you can see the reaction of our patrons. As Maria removed her apron, several of the kitchen staff approached to shake her hand or pat her shoulder appreciatively. Inez, the young chef, leaned in close. Thank you, she whispered, for reminding us why we started cooking in the first place. Maria felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the hot kitchen. As Chef Antoine led her and Lucia to the prestigious chef's table, a special spot with a view of both the kitchen and the dining room, she couldn't help but think of her mother and grandmother. How proud they would be to know their simple family recipes, born of necessity and love, had earned a place in one of the city's finest restaurants. You see, Lucia, she whispered to her daughter as they took their seats. Your grandpa was right. Simple doesn't mean small-minded. Chef Antoine approached their table with 2 glasses of champagne. To Maria, he said, raising his own glass to join theirs, who taught this old chef a new trick and reminded us all that the greatest ingredient in any dish is the love with which it is made. Maria watched in amazement as small portions of her coq au vin were plated with a care and attention she'd never imagined her home cooking would receive. Chef Antoine personally oversaw the plating, directing his staff with the same exacting standards he applied to his own creations. He added tiny sprigs of fresh herbs and delicate swirls of sauce, transforming Maria's humble stew into something that belonged in a food magazine. "Is all that decoration necessary?" Maria whispered to Lucia, seated beside her at the chef's table. "The taste won't change." Lucia squeezed her mother's hand. "It's their way of showing respect, Mama." From their unique vantage point, they could see both the kitchen's controlled chaos and the elegant calm of the dining room. The contrast was striking, like watching 2 different worlds operate side by side, connected by swinging doors and the food that traveled between them. Chef Antoine approached their table, wiping his hands on a towel tucked into his apron. "We're sending out the first plates now," he explained. "I've selected a few tables of regular customers, people whose opinions I trust." Maria felt a flutter of nervousness. It was one thing to cook for her family, who loved her no matter what. It was quite another to have strangers judge her food in a place where people paid more for one meal than she spent on groceries in a week. "What if they don't like it?" she asked quietly. The chef's expression softened. "They will like it, but even if they didn't," he gestured toward the kitchen where several staff members were still hovering near her pot, sneaking tastes when they thought no one was looking. "You've already won over the toughest critics in the house." A server appeared with 2 plates of Maria's coq au vin, beautifully arranged and garnished. He set them before Maria and Lucia with a flourish. "The chef insists you taste the final presentation," he explained with a small bow. Maria looked down at her dish, barely recognizing the food she'd prepared. On the gleaming white plate, the rich, dark sauce formed a perfect pool around pieces of chicken that had been arranged artfully, rather than simply piled in a bowl as she would have done at home. Pearl onions and mushrooms were placed with precision, and a light dusting of finely chopped parsley added color. She took a bite and closed her eyes. Despite all the fancy presentation, the taste was exactly as it should be. Rich, complex, with that perfect balance of sweet and acid that the blood orange provided. It tasted like home. When she opened her eyes, she found Chef Antoine watching her reaction carefully. "It's perfect," she said simply. "It tastes like my mother's kitchen." Something in the chef's expression shifted, a brief glimpse of emotion, quickly masked by professionalism. "That is the highest compliment," he said with a small nod. As they enjoyed their meal, Maria watched the servers deliver small tasting portions of her dish to selected tables throughout the dining room. Chef Antoine had arranged for the servers to explain that this was a special offering, a traditional family recipe being featured as a one-night-only addition to the menu. At the first table, a well-dressed older couple, the woman took a bite and immediately reached for her husband's hand, urging him to try it. They spoke animatedly to each other, then called the server back to ask questions. "They want to know where the recipe comes from," Chef Antoine reported, returning briefly to Maria's table. "They say it reminds the woman of something her grandmother made during her childhood in southern France." Similar scenes played out across the dining room as more people tasted Maria's creation. A group of young professionals who had been more focused on their phones than each other suddenly became engaged in conversation, gesturing toward their plates. A famous food critic, whom Chef Antoine pointed out discreetly, closed his eyes as he tasted the dish, then immediately made notes on his phone. "Your dish is causing quite a stir," the chef said, unable to keep a note of surprise from his voice. Word spread quickly through the restaurant. Soon tables that hadn't received the special tasting were asking about it, requesting to try the grandmother's coq au vin they'd heard about from other diners. "We don't have enough prepared to serve everyone," Chef Antoine admitted, looking genuinely regretful. "We only use the ingredients for your demonstration." "I can make more," Maria offered without hesitation, "if you want me to." The chef looked at her with newfound respect. You would do that? Return to the hot kitchen and cook again after I... He paused, clearly uncomfortable with acknowledging his earlier rudeness. After you invited me to show you my technique? Maria finished for him kindly. Of course. Cooking for others has always been my joy, not my burden. Chef Antoine nodded gratefully and led Maria back to the kitchen, where her appearance was greeted with smiles and nods of respect that would have been unimaginable just hours before. This time, though, she wasn't alone at the prep station. Inez and 2 other young chefs joined her, eager to learn her techniques firsthand. As Maria began the process again, now with helpers anticipating her needs and hanging on her every word, she felt a strange sense of coming full circle. Here she was, teaching these professionally trained chefs the same methods her mother and grandmother had taught her at their small kitchen table decades ago. The secret is patience, she told her rapt audience as she rendered the bacon fat slowly. So many people rush cooking. They turn the heat too high because they want to finish quickly. But some flavors only develop with time. Like people, Inez said thoughtfully, and Maria smiled at the young woman's insight. Exactly like people, she agreed. As she worked, Maria shared stories of her grandmother who had cooked for wealthy families but passed down recipes adapted for poorer households, of village feasts where everyone contributed what little they had to create meals that nourished both body and spirit, of teaching Lucia to cook when she was so small she needed to stand on a chair to reach the counter. The kitchen staff listened, asked questions, and shared some of their own stories in return. One chef had learned to cook from his father, who ran a small roadside stand. Another had a grandmother who insisted that singing to the food helped it taste better. Maybe she was right, Maria said with a laugh. My mother always hummed when she cooked. As the second batch of coq au vin simmered, filling the kitchen with its mouth-watering aroma once again, Chef Antoine approached Maria with an unusual request. Would you mind if I introduced you to some of our guests? Many have asked about the special dish, and when I explained it was a family recipe from one of our diners, well, they would like to meet you. Maria's eyes widened. Meet me? Why? Because what you've created has touched them, he said simply. Food has that power. To connect us to memories, to comfort us, to make us feel things we didn't expect to feel in a fancy restaurant on an ordinary Tuesday night. Nervous but curious, Maria agreed. She removed her apron and smoothed her dress, suddenly conscious again of how out of place she must look among the fashionable crowd. You look perfect, Lucia whispered, appearing at her side and linking their arms together. Just like always. Chef Antoine led them through the dining room, stopping at several tables to introduce Maria. To her astonishment, people stood to shake her hand. The older woman who had been reminded of her grandmother's cooking had tears in her eyes as she thanked Maria for bringing back a flavor she thought was lost to time. My grandmother was from a small village near the Spanish border, the woman explained. She used orange in her cooking too. I never knew anyone else who did that. The recipes traveled, Maria said, deeply moved by the connection, even when the people couldn't. At another table, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25 asked if she would consider sharing her recipe. I've been trying to. Cook more like my dad used to, he explained. He passed away last year, and I realize I never paid attention when he was in the kitchen. Your dish. It reminded me of Sunday dinners at our house. Maria touched his shoulder gently. I would be honored to share it with you. By the time they had made their way through the dining room, Maria felt almost dizzy with the experience. Never in her life had she imagined her cooking, the simple everyday act that had been as natural to her as breathing, would touch so many strangers in such a profound way. When they returned to their table, they found Chef Antoine had arranged for a special dessert to be served. A delicate orange-infused chocolate mousse created in honor of Maria's secret ingredient. A small tribute, he explained, from my kitchen to yours. As they enjoyed the dessert, the chef pulled up a chair and joined them for a moment, a rare honor that wasn't lost on the other diners, who watched with interest. Maria, he said, his usual commanding tone replaced with something more genuine. I owe you an apology. I brought you into my kitchen expecting to teach you a lesson. Instead, you taught all of us something valuable. Maria shook her head. There's no need. There is, he insisted. I forgot something essential about cooking, something that all the fancy techniques and expensive ingredients in the world can't replace. He gestured toward the dining room, where people were still talking animatedly about their experience. You reminded me that the best food makes people feel something. It creates connection. Your dish did that tonight in a way that mine haven't in a very long time. The sincerity in his voice touched Maria deeply. Thank you, she said simply, for giving my food a chance. Chef Antoine smiled, a real smile that transformed his usually serious face. I have a proposition for you if you're interested. Maria leaned forward, curious about what Chef Antoine might propose. The restaurant hummed around them, but at their table it felt like they were in their own little world. What sort of proposition? She asked, dabbing the corner of her mouth with a napkin. Chef Antoine's eyes sparkled with an excitement that made him look younger. I would like to feature your coq au vin on our menu, not as a one-time special, but as a permanent offering. Maria's hand froze mid-air. My recipe? Here? She glanced at Lucia, whose eyes had grown wide. We would call it coq au vin de Maria, the chef continued, and credit your family tradition right on the menu. Lucia reached for her mother's hand. That's incredible, Mama. But Maria hesitated, looking thoughtful. It's very kind, but would your customers really want something so simple? Your food is so... She gestured vaguely at the elegant surroundings. Artistic. Chef Antoine shook his head firmly. What happened tonight proves otherwise. Look around you. Maria glanced across the dining room. People were still talking, gesturing with animation. Some were looking their way with warm smiles. A few had even taken photos of their plates, something Maria had noticed happening more, and more in restaurants these days. Tonight I watched people stop their conversations about business and politics to close their eyes and truly taste something, the chef said. I saw them share bites with each other, reminisce about childhood meals, ask questions about ingredients. Your dish created an experience that goes beyond the plate. He leaned in, his voice growing more passionate. Do you know how rare that is? Especially in a place like this where people often come to be seen rather than to truly connect with their food or each other? Maria hadn't thought of it that way. In her world, food had always been about connection. The family gathered around the table, neighbors bringing dishes to share during celebrations, recipes passed down through generations. She hadn't realized that such basic human experiences might be missing from the lives of these wealthy diners. But I'm not a professional, she said, still uncertain. That's precisely why this works, Chef Antoine insisted. Your cooking has a soul to it that can't be taught in culinary school. It's something earned through years of cooking with love and necessity. He spread his hands. I can teach technique all day long. I cannot teach that. Maria thought for a moment. Would I need to work here? Because I don't live in the city. And no, the chef quickly clarified. I would like you to teach my staff, particularly Inez, who seems to have a natural affinity for your style. With your permission, they would prepare it according to your exact instructions. And perhaps if you were willing, you might visit occasionally as a special consultant. A consultant? Maria couldn't help but laugh at the formal title. Me? Absolutely, Chef Antoine nodded. And I would pay you, of course, for both the recipe and your expertise. Maria was speechless. The idea that someone would pay for what she had been doing for free her entire life seemed almost absurd. Cooking wasn't a special talent in her mind. It was just something everyone in her family did. There's more, the chef added, watching her reaction carefully. I've been thinking about starting something new. A special dinner series, perhaps monthly, highlighting home cooks and their family recipes. Different cultures, different backgrounds, but all with that same authenticity your dish has. The chef's expression grew thoughtful. We professional chefs, we get so caught up in innovation and presentation that sometimes we lose sight of why people really come together to eat. Tonight was A powerful reminder. Lucia squeezed her mother's hand. It sounds wonderful, Mama. Maria looked down at her weathered hands, hands that had prepared thousands of meals, hands that knew the feel of dough at exactly the right consistency, hands that could chop an onion without ever looking down. Never once had she imagined these hands would create something worthy of a place like Le Petit Jardin. I would be honored, she said finally, her voice soft but sure. Chef Antoine beamed and stood up, gesturing to a nearby server. This calls for a proper celebration. The server quickly appeared with a bottle of champagne and 3 glasses. As he poured, other staff members seemed to sense that something special was happening. The maitre d' wandered over, followed by a few of the kitchen staff who had been given permission to step out for a moment. When everyone had a glass, Chef Antoine raised his in a toast. To Maria, who came into our kitchen as a guest and leaves as a teacher. The small crowd that had gathered around their table raised their glasses with murmurs of agreement. Maria felt her cheeks flush with a mixture of embarrassment and pride. And to good food that brings people together, she added quietly, raising her own glass. As they sipped the champagne, far fancier than anything Maria had ever tasted, the restaurant's general manager approached their table with an odd expression. "Chef," he said in a low voice, "there's something you should know. Jean Bellard is here." Chef Antoine nearly choked on his champagne. "Bellard? The critic from Le Guide? Here, tonight?" The manager nodded, discreetly indicating a solitary man seated in the corner, scribbling in a small notebook. "He's been here for over an hour. He ordered the special coq au vin. Twice." Maria noticed the chef's face had gone slightly pale. "Is that important?" she whispered to Lucia. "Jean Bellard writes for the most prestigious restaurant guide in France," Lucia whispered back, having recognized the name from her food blogs. "His reviews can make or break a restaurant." Chef Antoine smoothed his jacket, his professional demeanor, returning instantly. "I should go speak with him." "Wait," Maria said impulsively, touching his arm. "May I come with you?" The chef looked startled. "You want to meet Bellard? He's not known for being particularly friendly." "He enjoyed my cooking," Maria said simply. "I'd like to thank him." After a moment's hesitation, Chef Antoine nodded. "Of course, it's your dish he's writing about after all." They made their way across the restaurant to the critics' table. Up close, Jean Bellard wasn't as intimidating as Maria had expected, just a thin man in his 60s with reading glasses perched on his nose and a meticulous way of writing in his notebook, each letter carefully formed. "Monsieur Bellard, chef," Antoine began formally. "What an unexpected pleasure to have you dining with us this evening." The critic looked up, his expression giving away nothing. "Chef Antoine." His accent was distinctly French, his tone neutral. His eyes shifted to Maria, taking in her simple dress and kind face with a flicker of interest. "I'd like to introduce you to Maria Rodriguez," the chef continued. "She is the creator of the special coq au vin you enjoyed tonight." Bellard's eyebrows rose slightly. "You?" he asked Maria directly. "You created this dish?" "My mother taught me," Maria replied honestly. "And her mother taught her. I just cooked it the way we always have." The critic studied her for a moment, then did something that made Chef Antoine stiffen in surprise. He smiled. It was a small smile, but genuine. "Madame Rodriguez, your dish took me back to my aunt's kitchen in Provence," Bellard said, his voice warming. "The addition of orange, so subtle, yet it changes everything. I haven't tasted a coq au vin like that since I was a boy." Maria smiled back, immediately at ease with this man who spoke of food with such genuine feeling. "Food should bring back good memories," she said. "That's when you know it's right." Bellard nodded, as if she'd said something profound. "Exactly." "So," he turned to Chef Antoine, "you were wise to feature this dish. It stands apart from everything else on your menu, which is technically perfect but sometimes lacks." He searched for the word. Heart. The chef absorbed the criticism with remarkable grace. "I'm learning that lesson tonight," he admitted. Bellard made a note in his book, then looked up again at Maria. "Will this dish become a regular offering?" Yes, Chef Antoine answered quickly. We're also planning a new dinner series featuring home cooks and their family recipes from various cultures. Maria will be our first featured cook. The critic wrote this down with evident interest. A bold departure for Le Petit Jardin. I look forward to following its development. He closed his notebook decisively. And I will certainly mention tonight's exceptional experience in my column. After they said their goodbyes and walked away from Bellard's table, Chef Antoine let out a long, slow breath. Do you have any idea what just happened? He asked Maria in a hushed tone. Maria shook her head, confused by his intensity. Jean Bellard smiled at you, and he told you he enjoyed your dish. The chef shook his head in wonder. In 20 years of reviewing restaurants, that man has been called the Stone Face because he never reveals his opinion to the chef. Never. He seemed nice enough to me, Maria said with a small shrug. Chef Antoine laughed, a genuine, unrestrained laugh that turned heads throughout the restaurant. Maria Rodriguez, you are a miracle worker in more ways than one. Back at their table, Lucia was bubbling with excitement when they told her about the conversation with the famous critic. Mama, do you realize what this means? You could become famous. Your recipe could be in magazines. Maria patted her daughter's hand. Let's not get carried away. It's just home cooking. It's never just home cooking, Chef Antoine corrected gently. What you do, what women like you have done for generations without recognition or praise, it's the foundation of all cuisine. The greatest chefs in the world started by copying their mothers and grandmothers. As the evening wound down, the restaurant gradually emptied of other guests. The staff began the nightly ritual of cleaning and preparing for the next day, but there was an unusual energy in the air, a buzz of conversation, frequent laughter, and many glances toward Maria's table. Finally, Chef Antoine brought over a folder. I've had my assistant draft a simple agreement, he explained, for the use of your recipe and your consulting role. Please take it home, read it carefully, and we can discuss any changes you'd like to make. Maria accepted the folder with a bemused expression. This all feels like a dream, she admitted. When Lucia brought me here tonight, I never imagined. Sometimes the most extraordinary evenings begin in the most ordinary way, the chef said, with a smile. That's the magic of food, and of people who know how to prepare it with love. As they prepared to leave, something unexpected happened. The kitchen staff began to emerge from the back, lining up near the door. As Maria walked past, each one nodded respectfully or smiled. Inez stepped forward and handed her a small package. My grandmother's recipe for orange cake, she explained softly, since you shared yours with us. Maria's eyes filled with tears as she accepted the gift. Chef Antoine walked them all the way to the entrance where their coats were waiting. Thank you, he said, taking Maria's hand between both of his, for reminding all of us why we chose this profession in the first place. As they stepped out into the cool night air, Lucia linked her arm through her mother's. So, how does it feel to be a culinary celebrity? Maria laughed and shook her head. Don't be silly. I'm just a woman who cooks for her family. Not anymore. Mama, Lucia said, her voice full of pride. Now you're a woman who cooks for everyone. 6 months had passed since that unforgettable night at Le Petit Jardin. Maria stood in front of her bathroom mirror, smoothing the collar of her new blouse. A gift from Lucia for this special occasion. It was a simple garment, but made of finer fabric than Maria usually wore, in a rich burgundy color that her daughter insisted brought out the warmth in her complexion. Are you nervous? Lucia called from the bedroom where she was gathering Maria's things. A little, Maria admitted, patting her hair, which she'd arranged in her usual neat bun. She had politely declined Lucia's offer to take her to a salon. Some changes were welcome, but others felt unnecessary. Her hands, though, she studied with mild surprise. The nails were still short and practical, but the skin looked softer, a result of the hand cream Chef Antoine's wife had given her, insisting. It was a professional necessity for anyone who worked with food as much as Maria did. The past 6 months had transformed Maria's life in ways she could never have imagined. After Jean Bellard's glowing review of her coq au vin appeared in his prestigious column, calling it a soulful masterpiece that puts much of modern haute cuisine to shame. Le Petit Jardin had been flooded with reservations from people specifically requesting the grandmother's dish. Chef Antoine had kept his word. Coq au vin de Maria became a permanent fixture on the menu, with a small note explaining its origins. The promised dinner series featuring home cooks had launched 2 months later with Maria as the inaugural guest chef. The event had sold out within hours of being announced. Most surprising of all was how quickly Maria had adapted to her new role as what Chef Antoine called a culinary consultant. Once a month, she took the train into the city and spent a day at the restaurant working alongside the staff. She'd even been given her own chef's jacket with Maria, embroidered in elegant script above the pocket, though she still preferred to cook in her own comfortable clothes when at home. "The car is here," Lucia called, interrupting Maria's reflections. "Are you ready?" Maria took one last look in the mirror. Tonight would be her first television appearance, a cooking segment on the country's most popular food show. The producers had called after seeing an article about Le Petit Jardin's unique collaboration with a home cook. At first, Maria had refused, terrified at the thought of cameras and lights and thousands of people watching her. But Chef Antoine had gently persisted, arguing that her story might inspire other home cooks to value their own culinary traditions. "The world needs fewer foams and gels," he'd said with a wink, "and more dishes that make people close their eyes when they take the first bite." In the car, Maria clutched her worn recipe notebook, the same one she'd been writing in for over 30 years. The show's producers had wanted to create a special card with her recipe printed on it, but Maria had insisted on bringing her actual notebook, with its food stains and handwritten notes in the margins. "This is the real thing," she told them. "People should see cooking as it actually happens in a home kitchen." "Remember what Chef Antoine said," Lucia reminded her, seeing her mother's nervousness. "Just pretend you're in your own kitchen, teaching me like you've done 100 times. Maria nodded, though her stomach still fluttered with butterflies. The city lights flashed past the car windows as they approached the television studio, a world so different from her small village that it might as well have been another planet. At the studio, they were met by a young production assistant with a clipboard and a headset. "Mrs. Rodriguez, we're so excited to have you." The young woman led them through a maze of corridors into a large studio space where a kitchen set had been built. Gleaming and perfect, like something from a magazine rather than a real working kitchen. Chef Antoine was already there, chatting with the show's host, a well-known television personality with a booming laugh and expertly styled hair. He spotted Maria and immediately came over, greeting her with the double-cheek kiss that had once made her uncomfortable but now felt natural. "Our star has arrived," he announced, leading her to meet the host. "So this is the famous Maria," the host exclaimed, taking both her hands in his. "The woman who taught Chef Antoine a thing or two about cooking. She teaches me something new every time we work together," the chef said, with genuine respect in his voice. The change in him over these months had been remarkable. The arrogance that had once defined him had softened into something more thoughtful. He still demanded perfection from his staff, but there was a new emphasis on the why of cooking, not just the how. As the makeup artist lightly powdered Maria's face, just to prevent shine under the lights, she'd explained, Maria watched the crew finishing the set preparations. Chef Antoine came to stand beside her. "Nervous?" he asked quietly. "Terrified," she admitted. "Don't be. Just cook like you always do. That's what people want to see, the real Maria, not some television version." The producer began calling for everyone to take their positions. Maria was guided to her mark behind the kitchen counter, with Chef Antoine beside her and the host on her other side. "We're going to start with some banter, then move into the cooking demonstration," the producer explained. "Just be yourself, Mrs. Rodriguez. That's why we invited you." 5, 4, 3, 2. The floor director counted down with his fingers, then pointed silently when they were live. "Welcome back," the host beamed at the camera. "Tonight we have a very special segment. You may have read about the home cook who stunned the culinary world by teaching one of our most celebrated chefs a new way to prepare a classic dish. Please welcome Chef Antoine Durand of Le Petit Jardin and his culinary consultant, Mrs. Maria Rodriguez. The lights seemed impossibly bright and Maria felt frozen for a moment. Then Chef Antoine gently touched her elbow, grounding her. "It's wonderful to be here," the chef said smoothly, giving her time to find her voice. "Yes, thank you for having us," Maria managed, her voice quiet but steady. The host launched into questions about that first night at the restaurant, with Chef Antoine telling the story with generous self-deprecation, making the audience laugh with his description of his own arrogance. "I invited Maria into my kitchen expecting to embarrass her," he admitted. "Instead, she taught all of us a valuable lesson about what truly matters in cooking." As the conversation continued, Maria gradually relaxed. The questions were ones she could answer easily, about her mother and grandmother, about growing up, cooking for a large family, about the importance of passing down recipes through generations. "So many young people today don't learn to cook," she said, finding herself growing passionate. "They think it's too hard or takes too long. But the simple dishes, the ones that feed the soul as well as the body, these don't require fancy techniques or expensive ingredients." When it came time for the actual cooking demonstration, Maria forgot about the cameras entirely. The familiar rhythm of chopping, stirring, and tasting transported her back to her own kitchen. She explained each step in her straightforward way, emphasizing the importance of patience and attention over rigid rules. "The recipe is just a starting point," she told the audience, echoing what she'd told Inez months ago. "You have to watch and smell and taste. The food will tell you what it needs." The host seemed genuinely fascinated, asking questions that showed he was actually interested in learning, not just moving through the segment. When Maria added the blood orange juice to the simmering wine sauce explaining her grandmother's adaptation, there was a murmur of interest from the crew off camera. "That's the secret ingredient that made Jean Bellard close his eyes in bliss," Chef Antoine told the audience with a theatrical wink. The man known as the Stone Face actually smiled. As they reached the end of the segment, the dish nearly complete and filling the studio with its mouth-watering aroma, the host turned serious for a moment. "Maria, you've become something of a sensation in the culinary world these past few months. Your dish is now famous. You consult at one of the country's top restaurants, and I understand there's even talk of a cookbook. How has this changed your life?" Maria considered the question, gently stirring the sauce as she gathered her thoughts. "The fancy parts, the television, the reviews, people recognizing me on the train, those still feel strange," she admitted, with a small smile. "But the cooking itself, sharing recipes, teaching others what my mother taught me, that feels exactly right. Like maybe this was what I was supposed to be doing all along." "And Chef Antoine," the host turned to the professional, "what has working with Maria taught you?" The chef didn't hesitate. "That true culinary innovation doesn't always mean adding something new. Sometimes it means rediscovering what we've lost, the patience, the intuition, the connection to food as more than just fuel or entertainment." He glanced at Maria with genuine affection. "In our rush to be creative and original, many chefs have forgotten that the most important ingredient is one you'll never find in a professional kitchen inventory." "And what's that?" the host asked. "Love," Chef Antoine said simply. "Not the romantic kind, but the love that comes from wanting to nourish others. From seeing cooking not as a performance, but as a gift you give to the people around your table." When the segment ended and the cameras stopped rolling, the crew broke into spontaneous applause. The show's culinary staff descended on the demonstration counter, eager to taste the finished dish. "You're a natural," the host told Maria, helping himself to a spoonful of the sauce. "The camera loves you. So authentic, so real." He closed his eyes as he tasted. "And this is extraordinary." In the dressing room afterward, as Maria gathered her things, there was a knock at the door. A young woman stood there, maybe in her early 20s, clutching a worn notebook similar to Maria's own. "Mrs. Rodriguez? I'm one of the production assistants. She hesitated, then held out her notebook. "My abuela kept a recipe book like yours. She passed away last year and I inherited it but never knew what to do with it. I don't really cook." She looked down, a little embarrassed. But watching you today, I thought maybe I could try. Would you sign her book? It would have meant so much to her. Maria felt a lump form in her throat as she carefully took the notebook, with its faded handwriting and splattered pages, evidence of countless meals prepared with care. She signed her name gently on the inside cover, then handed it back. Your grandmother would be proud to know you're keeping her recipes alive, she said softly. Start with something simple. The food will teach you the rest. After the young woman left, clutching the notebook to her chest, Lucia came in to help her mother gather her things. You were amazing, Mama, she said, hugging Maria tightly. I always knew you were special, but now everyone else knows it too. As they left the studio, Chef Antoine was waiting by the exit to say goodbye. You're going to get calls from every television show in the country after this, he predicted with a grin. Maria laughed and shook her head. One is enough, I think. She hesitated, then added, but the cookbook idea, I've been thinking about that. Not just my recipes, but stories about where they came from, who taught them to me. It will be wonderful, the chef said firmly. A cookbook with a soul. Outside, the night was clear and cool. As they waited for their car, Maria looked up at the city lights, so different from the star-filled skies of her village. 6 months ago, she would never have imagined standing here like this, a woman whose cooking was respected by world-class chefs, whose recipe was printed on expensive menus, who had just been on national television. Happy? Lucia asked, seeing her mother's thoughtful expression. Maria nodded slowly. Yes, but not because of all this. She gestured toward the television studio. I'm happy because cooking has always been my way of showing love. And now, somehow, I get to share that love with more people than I ever thought possible. As their car pulled up, Maria took one last look at the bright studio building behind them. Life took such unexpected turns. All those years of cooking in her humble kitchen, she'd never once thought of herself as special or talented. She was just a woman feeding her family the best way she knew how. Yet here she was, proof that sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin in the most ordinary places, like a simple kitchen where a grandmother teaches a young girl to add a splash of orange to her coq au vin, passing down not just a recipe, but a legacy of love that would one day touch the world.